Namaste and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our Bhagavad Gita class. Om Parthaya Pratibodhitam Bhagavata Narayanena Swayam Vyasena Gratitam Purana Munina Madhye Mahabharatam Advaitam Ritavarshinim Bhagavatim Ashtadashadhyayinim Amba Tvam Anusandadhami Bhagavad Gite Bhavadveshinim Vasudeva Sutan Devam Kamsa Chanuramardanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishnam Vande Jagadgurum Mukam Karoti Vachalam Pangum Langhayate Girim Yatkripa Tamaham Vande Paramananda Madhavam. Om, O Mother Bhagavad Gita, we meditate on you who were made known to Partha, Arjuna, by the Lord Narayana himself. You who were included in the Mahabharata by the ancient sage Vyasa. You, the goddess who rains down the nectar of Advaita, non-dualism, in 18 chapters. You, the destroyer of relative existence. We worship Krishna, world teacher, the son of Vasudeva, the supreme delight of his mother Devaki, and the destroyer of the demons Kamsa and Chanur. We adore that supremely blissful Madhava, by whose grace the mute are made eloquent and the lame are enabled to cross over mountains. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Om peace, peace, peace be unto us all. So tonight we are to take up chapter 18 of the Gita, the last chapter of the Gita, and this is the chapter known as Moksha Sannyasa Yogo Nama, the chapter known as the Yoga of the liberation of renunciation, Moksha Sannyasa. And so the last chapter, which we concluded our present study of last week, was about the three gunas, the three qualities which are the constituents of all of relative existence, the foundation of relativity itself, the gunas of sattva, rajas, and tamas. And this chapter begins with a further discussion of the three gunas. Not only that, but it is concerned with the three gunas. And so the discussion continues for a number of verses at the beginning of this chapter. But this chapter is extremely important. It contains some of the very famous verses of the Gita. And it ends on the note of the complete surrender to God, where Sri Krishna, much like Jesus in the Christian Bible, Sri Krishna tells Arjuna that by giving up all other dharmas, that is, giving up all other sense of that which is to be done and that which has to be done, all the other senses of duty, all other senses of responsibility, etc., by surrendering to me, that is to God, by surrendering to me, you will attain to everything. And I will destroy all sin within you. Aham tvap sarvapapebhyo mokshayishyami ma shucha. Don't worry, I will liberate you from all sin by having renounced all dharmas, that is, all other supports in your life, and surrendering to me alone. So as with, from a Hindu standpoint, I should say, As with the Hindu interpretation of many of Jesus's sayings in the Christian Bible, sometimes he's speaking of himself as a man with a human history, but more often he's speaking of himself as God, as one with the Father, one with God. And so Sri Krishna also sometimes speaks of himself in terms of his human being, and more often in terms of his divine being, that is, his unity with God. So he's not speaking of himself as Krishna, born of Vasudeva and Devaki, and brought up in Vrindavan, etc. He's speaking of himself through his real identity as the divine being itself, which is the same divine being which manifests in many other forms, many other aspects. And so when he says that by renouncing all other supports in your life and taking refuge in me alone, I will save you from all sin. Moksha ishyami, it doesn't mean save, it means I will liberate you. That is, you will attain to liberation through complete surrender to me. So not speaking of himself as separate from God, as surrendering to me as opposed to some other teacher or some other deity or whatever. No, surrendering to me who am God, you will attain to perfection. So, but this chapter begins with a discussion of renunciation. So as so often with chapters in the Gita, they begin with a question or a doubt of Arjuna, which the previous discussion has raised. So again, the previous discussion was about sattva, rajas, and tamas, the three gunas, and how they affect different types of austerity, different types of charity, different types of faith, different types of spiritual practice, etc. So everything can be categorized by the predominance of one or more of these three gunas. So Arjuna begins by asking a question related to the three gunas. Let me say in the beginning of this chapter, for those of you who have not attended previous classes, just in case there are some, and just to remind all of us, that the three gunas, sattva, rajas, tamas, the adjectives are sattvika, rajasika, and tamasika. And so sattva is the quality of equilibrium, of purity, of transparency, of intelligence, clarity, etc., the highest of the three gunas, that which we want to attain. We want to attain to a state of sattva because in that the mind has clear understanding. It can almost perceive the truth directly because the mind is so clear, so transparent, so luminous. And then there's the quality of rajas, the quality of action and inaction, action and reaction, passion, going up and going down, the agony and the ecstasy. I like this and I hate that, and so forth. That type of passionate engagement and so forth is rajas. And also it has the qualities of egotism and pride and so forth. And so that is where most of us dwell most of the time. And then there is tamas, the lowest of the three qualities, the quality of darkness, of inertia, laziness, ignorance, delusion, confusion, it's cloudiness, etc. And so the whole of this universe is the interplay of these three forces. So now let us come to the text, chapter 18. And as I said, it begins with Arjuna's question. Arjuna vacha sannyasasya mahabaho tattvamichhami veditum tyagasya cha hrishikesha pritakkesha nishudana. So here he says, Arjuna vacha, Arjuna says to Sri Krishna, sannyasasya mahabaho tattvamichhami veditum. I want, O Mahabaho. He addresses Sri Krishna by one of the many epithets that he uses for Sri Krishna. Mahabaho means the great armed one, the one with great arms, meaning the one who is a warrior and very, very strong. So, O Mahabaho, O long armed one, I want to know the truth of sannyasa. I want to know the truth of sannyasa. And I'll come back and explain what sannyasa means here, because here it's a somewhat technical term. And then the second line of the same verse says, Tyagasya cha hrishikesha pritak keshi nishudana. O Keshi Nishudana, O slayer of the demon Keshi. And he also calls him Rishikesha, which has various meanings. The one who delights, who is the controller of the senses, the one who delights the senses. I also want to know the differences with Tyaga. So he's asking about sannyasa and tyaga. And he's using these heroic names for Sri Krishna because certainly if you are the destroyer, the slayer of the demon Keshi, and if you are Mahabaho, the one with the great arms, that is strong arms, then certainly you are powerful enough to destroy my delusion, to destroy my confusion over this issue. So I want to know the truth of sannyasa, and I want to know how it differs in various ways from tyaga. So sannyasa, one of the meanings of sannyasa, of course, is the process of renouncing the world to become a sannyasi or a Swami. The one who renounces the world is a sannyasi. So sannyasa has the sense of renunciation. But here he will define it, Sri Krishna will define it in the coming verse. And tyaga also means renunciation. So sannyasa means, oftentimes means formal renunciation. It doesn't mean that here. Here, as we will see, it means a particular type of renunciation. And tyaga, which also means giving up, refers to another type of renunciation. So Arjuna wants to know what the difference between these two terms is variously, that is, in some detail. So the running translation goes, O mighty armed Rishikesha, O slayer of the demon Keshi, I want to know severally the truth about sannyasa and also about tyaga. So verse 2 begins his extended answer. Shri Bhagavan Vacha Kamyanam Karmanam Nyasam Sanyasam Kavayo Viduhu Sarva Karma Phalatyagam Prahustyagam Vichakshanaha. So here Shri Bhagavan Vacha, the Blessed Lord said, so Shri Krishna answers, Kamyanam Karmanam Nyasam Sanyasam Kavayo Viduhu. Kavayo Viduhu, the sages. Kavi, of course, means poet, but in Vedic times, a kavi was known, or sage was known as a kavi, because the great poets were the ones who were the rishis who wrote the Vedas. And so here the sages know sannyasa to mean the giving up of kamyanam karmanam, the giving up of actions motivated by desires. So those actions which are motivated by desire, the giving up of those actions is sannyasa. And again, as we go through the coming verses, we'll get a little clearer idea of what he's talking about. But let me say for now that this first half of the verse refers to, because of the time when this was written, this refers to Vedic actions which were done with a desire for results. That is, performing certain sacrifices with the result of going to heaven after death, or performing sacrifices in order to get wealth and progeny and so forth, to get the good things of life. So in the Vedas, there are many types of sacrifices, and each has its particular fruits that can be gained through the proper performance. So by performing a particular sacrifice, you get a desired end. And you do the sacrifice oftentimes because you want a desired end. That's the reason for performing a particular sacrifice, other than those that were supposed to be done every day, no matter what. But special sacrifices were performed with particular ends in view. And so the giving up of those actions, he says, Sri Krishna says, is sannyasa. So again, that's the definition for now. And the second half says, Sarva karma phala tyagam prahus tyagam vichakshanaha. And so vichakshanaha, those who are adepts, those who are masters, those who are wise and who are seeing, they say prahu. They say that sarva karma phala tyagam prahu. The tyaga is called the giving up of the fruits of all actions. So this distinction is being made between sannyasa in this context right now, which means giving up actions which are scripturally prescribed actions which are desire-oriented, which are desire-motivated. I want this, and so I'll do this sacrifice. Giving up those desire-oriented actions. And tyaga is being used, again, here he's defining the terms, he's using it in a technical sense. Tyaga means the giving up of the desire for the fruits of all actions. Whatever it is that you do, give up the desire for the fruits. And so this, of course, those of you who have been with the study of the Gita for some chapters will know that this is a recurring theme in the Bhagavad Gita, both the idea of giving up action and the idea of, that is, giving up action itself, and the idea of giving up the desire for the fruits of actions, even though you continue to act. So then Sri Krishna says in the third verse, Tyajyam doshavadityeke karma prahur manishinaha yajnadana tapakarma natyajyam iti chapare. So tyajyam doshavad iti eke karma prahu manishinaha. So manishinaha, the wise ones, manishinaha, the wise ones, say, prahu, that karma, the doshavad, being beset with evil, action being tainted by evil by its very nature, tyajyam, should be given up. So tyajyam doshavad ityeke, eke manishinaha. So some wise people say that work, because it is doshavad, because it is inherently connected to evil. Here, evil doesn't mean in the Western Christian sense of evil, the sinful or something like that. It just means it's brings harm. It brings suffering. So some learned persons say that action beset with evil as it is should be renounced, should be given up. And then yajna danatava karma natyajyam iti chapare. Apare cha and others say that yajna danatapa karma, sacrifice, charity, and austerity karma, these karmas should not be given up. Natyajyam iti chapare. So again, the running translation is, some learned persons say that action beset with evil as it is should be given up. And others say that actions such as sacrifice, charity, and austerity should not be given up. So in the Vedic times, even things like austerity, sacrifice, charity, those were religiously prescribed things that you were supposed to do, but they also brought fruits. And so that's why here this distinction is being made, that some wise people say that action, because it is tainted by evil, it should be given up. Just all desire-motivated action should be given up. Because if it's motivated by desire, it is evil by its nature. But then he says there are others who say that sacrifice, charity, and tapas, austerity, spiritual practice, should not be given up. Some learned persons say that action beset with evil as it is should be given up, and others say that actions such as sacrifice, charity, and austerity should not be given up. And so then he goes on on the same idea. Nischayam shrinume tatra tyage bharata tat sattama tyago hi purusha vyaghra trividha samprakirtitaha. So, Nischayam Srinume Tatra Tyage Bharata Sattama, O best of the Bharatas, that is the Bharata race, the descendants of King Bharata, uh, the lineage to which Arjuna belonged, all of the Pandavas belonged. So, O best of the Bharata lineage, here my conviction regarding this matter, the matter of whether one should give up all actions or whether one should continue with the sacrifice, charity, and spiritual practice. And then he goes in the second line of the verse, Tyago hi purusha vyagra trividha samprakirtitaha. So he's not yet saying what his opinion is. That will come in a moment. But he says in the second half that, O Purusha Vyagra, that is, O tiger among men, Purusha Vyagra, tiger among men, which means best of men, greatest of men, strongest of men. Tyaga, again, in this technical sense of giving up the desire for all, the fruits of all actions, Trividha Samprakirtitaha, is known as being threefold. There are three types of Tyaga. So, O Arjuna, there are three types of Tyaga. So here, this conviction of mine regarding this matter. And then verse 5, he gives what his opinion is. Yajna dana tapa karma natyajyam kamyameva tat. I'm sorry. Yajnadana tapa karma natyajyam karyameva tat. Yajnyodanam tapaschaiva pavanani manishinam. So here he says that yajna dana tapa karma, that is the actions of sacrifice, charity, and austerity or spiritual practice, natyajyam, should not be given up. Karyam evatat, they indeed should be done. You should not give up sacrifice, charity, and spiritual practice. Rather, you should do them. Yajno danam tapaschaiva pavanani manishinam. So of the wise, manishinam, of the wise, yajna, sacrifice, dana, charity, tapaschaiva, and also austerity or spiritual practice, pavanani, they are purifiers of the wise. So the wise take up these three actions: sacrifice, charity, and austerity or spiritual practice, because they purify the mind and the body. And the body also is purified through these. As Sri Ramakrishna says in the Gospel, a spiritual aspirant gradually creates a new body through spiritual practice. The body is recreated. It becomes a spiritualized body, so that it's both capable of being an instrument of receiving spiritual experience, and it's capable of retaining the effects of that spiritual experience without breaking. Oftentimes, people who have a sudden spiritual awakening without having undergone practice, that happens sometimes. I've seen it myself. Ordinary people who suddenly have a spiritual awakening, oftentimes because of something sudden happening in their life which is about to break them, and instead of breaking, then they have a sudden spiritual awakening. But if they have not practiced spiritual discipline beforehand, it can be devastating. It can shatter the nerves. And so that's never to be hoped for. Again, it sometimes happens, and I know of people who have gotten through it and have lived, it was a great blessing to them in the long run, and other people who were destroyed by it. So through these actions of sacrifice, of charity, and of spiritual practice, the body itself is remade. So that we can retain spiritual experience and so that we become sensitive to spiritual experience. But much more importantly, the mind becomes purified. So these are purifiers. So again, he says in the running translation, Since sacrifice, charity, and austerity are verily the purifiers of the wise, therefore actions such as sacrifice, charity, and austerity are not to be abandoned. They are surely to be undertaken. So again, they're in traditional sannyasa, in Vedanta, those who take to sannyasa, like myself, those who become swamis, take to sannyasa. The traditional idea was that when one becomes a sannyasi, one gives up all action. That is, except for the necessary actions of begging for your food and taking a bath, but all of your time, other than just the maintenance of the body, all of your other time is to be given to spiritual inquiry, to trying to keep the mind fixed in God. And that's a wonderful thing if one can do that. But the problem is that it's a beautiful ideal and possible for a handful of people at any time in history. But for most people who try it, it's not possible. And so that's why Swami Vivekananda said, as Sri Krishna says in the Gita, he says that we should engage in work which is beneficial to society, not for our own benefit, not to help ourselves, not to aggrandize ourselves, not to make money for ourselves, etc., but we should work for the welfare of society, because that will give the activity that the mind and body need to stay healthy for the average spiritual aspirant, and also it will bring great benefit to society. So here in the traditional commentaries, and I agree with them on this point, in the traditional commentaries, they say that Sri Krishna is talking about the average person, not talking about those high adhikaris, as they're called technically, those of great fitness, those who are of the highest fitness, who are ready to give up all action except for just the bare maintenance of the body and keep the mind focused on the divine. Except for those few, the rest should engage in action. So again, the traditional commentators say that he's not speaking to those who are of that highest fitness. He's speaking to ordinary people like us. And so since sacrifice, charity, and austerity are verily the purifiers of the wise, therefore actions such as these are not to be abandoned. They are surely to be undertaken. Natyajam karyameva tat. Natyajam, not to be abandoned, karyameva tat. They are to be performed. So let me just stop for a moment and speak a little bit about sacrifice, charity, and austerity. So sacrifice here in the Gita, because this was a text from late Vedic times, and so we always have to remember that, when Sri Krishna is speaking, we have to remember the context in which he was speaking in order to properly interpret his words, because with changing times, customs change, and the meaning of words also becomes altered. And here Sri Krishna, when he speaks about sacrifice, he's speaking about the sacrifices of Vedic times, the actual sacrifices that you performed into a fire, when you made oblations into a fire and did various types of practices associated with the sacrifice. Some of the sacrifices were simple and done daily. Some of the sacrifices were very, very elaborate. Some of them took a year or more to perform. And so when he speaks of sacrifice, he's talking of that. But what about us? People don't perform Vedic sacrifices anymore, with very minor exception. The Vedic sacrifices are not done, and certainly the average devout Hindu doesn't perform Vedic sacrifices except with rare exception. So what does sacrifice mean for us? Well, we have to universalize the meaning. Sacrifice meaning that we have to, as Sri Krishna himself teaches in the Gita, especially in the 4th chapter, we have to see sacrifice as the very nature of action itself, that all actions are sacrificial. And so all of our actions being sacrificial, if we see our actions as sacrificial, all of them can be performed as sacrifice. We should learn to perform them as sacrifice. Let me step back for a moment and say that, as I said a minute ago, When reading the Gita, we have to understand the context in which it was given in order to understand what he's saying to Arjuna. But we also have to learn to apply that in our present context. And so it's like, to take a modern example, which is much discussed here in America, it's like those justices of the Supreme Court. Some of them say that they are originalists. That is, that they adhere to the strict text as it was written and as words were meant at the time of writing the Constitution. So if the Constitution says something, we have to understand what that meant at the time the person who wrote it would have meant, and to keep it strictly to that. There are others who say that the grand principles enshrined in the Constitution, that they can't be limited just to the historical understanding of people 2 or 3 centuries ago, 2 centuries ago, because the meanings or the society itself has changed. We have to apply the meaning of the Constitution to the changed circumstances of society. We can't be held back by the originalists' interpretation. So what I'm saying is that both are important for understanding. To understand what Sri Krishna is saying, we have to see what words meant at the time of Sri Krishna, at least what concepts mean. We don't have to be scholars to do that. We just have to have a general understanding of Vedic times and what life was like and what basic concepts meant at that time. But we can't be limited to that. Just as one's interpretation of the Constitution, if it's just restricted to what words meant at the time of the writing, then what about the changing times? What we find with a document like the Constitution is that it embodies certain ideas, certain principles which are very grand, which the founders themselves might not have seen all of the implications of these concepts, because those implications were not present to them at that time. And so we have to see what is the principle behind the words and how that principle applies to the varied circumstances that the founders never confronted. They never had to confront. They didn't even know about them. They couldn't know about them. So a purely originalist view of a document like the Constitution or the Gita is absurd. But it has its importance to understand the meaning at the time, and then we have to understand how we can apply it in our present day. And so with yajna, dana, tapa, these 3 which are purifiers and which should be engaged in, they should not be given up. So yajna, how does it purify the mind? Because the idea of sacrifice is giving up, giving over, surrendering. And so that act takes seeing action as sacrificial, it takes the ego out of the equation, the ahamta and mamata, the I-ness and the mindness out of things. It takes that out of things. But this action should be done because it's good and because it's part of this grand cosmic sacrifice. And I am just a part of that grand cosmic sacrifice. And so this is just my part in the grand offering of one thing into another. An offering of life force, offering of love, offering of energy, all of that goes into action. That every action is sacrificial by nature, and that the whole universe proceeds on the basis of sacrifice. That's the fundamental nature of the universe. That is, life lives on life, and that life which has lived on other life itself will be lived on by other life in time. Life gives way to death, and death gives way to new life. Spring gives way to summer, summer gives way to fall, fall gives way to winter, and winter again gives way to spring. The seasons move into each other. Childhood is given up, is sacrificed into youth. Youth is sacrificed into adulthood. Adulthood is sacrificed into old age. And old age is sacrificed into decline and death. And so everything here is a sacrifice. I take things from society and I have to give back to society. Someone teaches me something, and I have to continue the sacrifice by passing on the knowledge and experience I have gained through the help of others, by passing that on to other people. So everything is that process of taking in, receiving, and then giving back in sacrifice. So that purifies the mind because, again, it takes the ego and the possessiveness out of the equation. And then dana, charity, that, of course, is a type of sacrifice, of a specific instance of sacrifice. We want to possess, we want to have. And if we become possessed of a spirit of charity, we become charitable by nature, then that is reversed. Then we give, we want to give, we delight in giving. And so that also is a wonderful purification of the mind. I remember as a small kid, like other small kids, how possessive I was at certain stages of my childhood, probably much longer than I should have been. But that strong possessiveness of a young child who hasn't learned how and doesn't want to learn how to share. I remember, just as one example, a silly example, that my older brother, he was 3 years older than me, and one day my mother took, and I was just beginning school. I was in I think I was in kindergarten. I didn't even know how to read yet. But I had some books that my mother would read to me. So my older brother and I were taken to this drugstore by my mother, or like a convenience store in the neighborhood. And so we saw this display of children's books in the store on one of those rotating stands of children's books. And so we both picked out books that we wanted, and both of us had a little money. We had some coins and things, but I had left mine at home. And so my brother was picking out books he wanted. I picked out books I wanted, and then I said, but I don't have my money. So my older brother, very kind and generous, as he always was, generous, he said, well, don't worry, I'll buy yours and you pay me back when we get home. So I was delighted with that. So we bought all the books we wanted. We got back home, and my brother asked me for the money, and I refused to give it to him. I had my books and I had my money too, and nobody was going to take that away from me. So that kind of possessiveness, which is so strong in children, some of that remains into adulthood. And then some of us even cultivate that further in adulthood. Whatever is mine, and what's yours is mine too, if I can get it away from you. And so charity purifies that, developing the spirit of charity, as my brother demonstrated, the immediate willingness to give money to help his little brother. So developing that sense of sharing, that sense of helping others, that purifies the mind of that terrible selfishness and possessiveness that we have. And then tapas, austerity or spiritual practice. That, of course, purifies the mind and the body because it teaches us to focus the mind. Impurity of the mind is a distracted mind, where the mind is going in all directions. It's dissipated, it's distracted. And so through tapas, through austerity, through spiritual practice, we collect the rays of the mind. And that is that is one of the meanings, one of the central meanings of purity of the mind. When the mind is pure, the mind becomes focused. The mind becomes integral. The mind becomes integrated. It becomes whole. And so these three actions, he says, should not be given up because they are natyajam, not to be given up. Karyameva tat, they should be performed because they are purifiers. And so then we come to verse 6. Etanyapi tu karmani sangam tyaktva phalani cha kartavyani tibme partha nishchitam mattamuttamam. So etani api tu karmani sangam tyaktva phalani cha kartavyani. Even these actions should be performed. Kartavyani, etani kartavyani. These should be performed. Sangam tyaktva phalani cha, giving up attachment and giving up the results of the action. That is basically giving up the attachment to the results of the action. So these actions, sacrifice, charity, and spiritual practice, they should be engaged in. Again, he's not talking about liberated souls who are beyond all duty whatsoever. They're absolutely free. They're beyond all duty. But for others who are working towards their liberation, who are trying, whether householder or monk, they should develop these three qualities. Now, many people would say, especially traditional people would say, that a monk, even if he's just an aspiring monk, sannyasi, should give up these three also. That's not what Sri Krishna is saying. But it's true that a monk has to interpret these a little differently from a householder. But for a monk also, as Swami Vivekananda said, in the absence of austerity, tapas, monastic orders decline, and in the absence of teaching and preaching, they decline as well. And so sacrificing and giving for a sannyasi doesn't mean going out and making money to give money to people. It doesn't mean that, because that's not the life of a sannyasi. But it does mean the spirit of sacrifice and the spirit of charity and giving that which you do have, being willing to share that, and practicing spiritual practice. That is for all, whether householder or sannyasi, until one has attained to perfection, vidvat sannyasa, one who is a sannyasi who knows already, who has attained to the highest illumination. For them, all duties fall away. There's no should about such a person. They dwell in a state of perfection. So, iti me partha nishchitam matam uttamam. This, O Partha, is my highest opinion. That is, this opinion that these should be done, having given up attachment to the fruits of the action. But the running translation is, but even these actions, which he'd said in the previous verse, are not to be given up, they're to be done. But even these actions have to be undertaken by renouncing attachment and the hankering for results. This is my firm and best conclusion, O son of Pritha, that is, O Partha. This is my firm and highest conclusion, that these actions are to be performed, but you should give up attachment and the results. So here he makes a distinction, and that's actually what Sri Krishna says also. He makes a distinction between attachment and the results. So the results means, of course, the desire for the results, but the attachment to the work itself. That is, those things that we've gotten so used to, those actions that we've become so used to, that they've become habit, then we find we can't give them up. Just a simple example. When I was a teenager back in the 60s, I was hitchhiking across country, and I hitchhiked all the way across the country and back from East Coast to West. So I had many, many rides along the way. So I don't remember where it happened, and it doesn't matter, but somewhere in the Midwest, a man in a pickup truck out in the middle of nowhere picked me up by the side of the freeway. And oftentimes in those days when hitchhiking was common and it was relatively safe enough, so many people did it, people would pick up hitchhikers oftentimes because they wanted somebody to talk to. Sometimes it's just out of kindness, and oftentimes because they wanted somebody to talk to in the car. So this man picked me up, an old retired man driving a car. And he told me that he would drive 50 miles every day to pick up his mail. And then as he went on talking about his life, he said, it's not that I need to go 50 miles to get my mail. I could have the mail delivered to where I live, and I wouldn't have to go anywhere. But I used to be a truck driver, so I was always on the road. And so now in my retirement, if I'm not driving, I just feel useless. And so I keep my address 50 miles away, so every day I have to drive there to pick up the mail. So not that that's a bad thing. There's nothing wrong with that. The poor man, he had nothing else to entertain him with, and he was used to driving. But that's what is meant by attachment to the action itself. That is something we've gotten so used to, we can't give it up even if we need to, and we feel bad about giving it up when we have to. That we can understand. All of these things are human experience. We can understand, and we can sympathize with people who have that trouble, because we ourselves see how difficult it is within ourselves. But giving up the attachment to the action and the hankering for the results of action. So those are to be given up. And as I've said many times in the course of this class over the last almost 3 years now, that giving up the desire for the fruits of action doesn't mean giving up the fruits themselves. It means that you do the action to the best of your ability, and whether the fruits come or don't come, that's not your concern. You accept them when they come, but if the work fails, you try to learn to keep your mind in equanimity, whether your work is successful or whether it fails, not to get frustrated, not to get upset, but to keep the mind the same, because you realize that the value of work is not what you get out of it. That's what binds you, is being attached to what you get out of it. The value of work is its transformational character. If you do work with non-attachment, you find that work has the ability to transform you, to spiritualize you, to purify you. And again, if you get the fruits from your action, that's okay, but you don't, that's not why you're doing it. You're doing it because it's there to be done, it needs to be done, and you use it as an instrument for self-transformation. So then verse 7, he continues, Niyatasya tu sannyasah karmano nopapadyate mohattasya parityagas tamasa parikirtitaha. So here he begins analyzing the work according to the three gunas. Oh, I forgot one thing. That was, where was that? It must be in verse 4. Ah, yes, in verse 4, it said that tyaga, that is renunciation of the desire for fruits of action, is of three types, is known to be of three types. And I never mentioned what those three types are. Now is when he takes up those three types of tyaga. And the three types are according to the three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas. So there are three types of tyaga, that is the renunciation of the fruits of action, according to whether it is of a tamasic nature, rajasic nature, or sattvic nature. So he begins with tamas, the tamasic nature here. So niyatasya tu sannyasaha, the renunciation of prescribed action, daily duty. That is, the things that you're supposed to do every day, the nitya karma, the daily duties of a religious person, things that you're supposed to do every day. The renunciation of those daily duties, karmano nopapadyate, is not to be done, is not justifiable. So giving up of your daily duties, those things which you are supposed to do, those things that if you don't do, you become a bad person. If you don't do them, you are becoming less of a person. So those things which are the necessary things for you to do to fulfill your responsibilities, those are not, the giving up of those is not justified. Mohat tasya parityagas tamasa parikirtitaha. That out of delusion, giving those daily responsibilities up, that is known as tamasic renunciation of action. So those who give up their actual duties, the actual things that they are responsible for, those the things that others are depending on them for, not the responsibilities we assume just because I want to feel important or something, but the things that I actually need to do. The responsibility of a family person, for spouse and for children, and for elderly parents, the responsibilities one has for agreements one has made with others, promises one has made with others, the responsibilities you have for the work that you do, etc. To give those up is not justifiable, he's saying here. Those things which are part of your daily responsibility. Now, in the Gita, again, going back to the originalist interpretation, nitya karma means those things which the Vedas say you're supposed to do every day. So it's a technical term at the time when this was expounded, and even for a long time later, up until almost modern times in Hinduism. Nitya karma or niyatam karma was that work which you were supposed to do every day because it was prescribed by the scriptures, by the Vedas primarily, and then later by the Hindu law books. And it's said in the tradition that you get no good karma for doing the things that you're supposed to do. You're not getting good karma because you do the things you're supposed to do. If you don't do them, you get bad karma. So that's the definition of what a nitya karma, a daily responsibility is. If you do it, it's because you're expected to do it. You don't get any praise for doing the things you're supposed to do. If a mother feeds her children, people don't write paeans of praise and poems about what a great mother she is because she fed her children. No, that's what she's supposed to do. However, if she doesn't feed her children, then great sin comes. And so the things that you're supposed to do every day, you do them because you're supposed to do them. And if you don't do them, you get sin. So here, tamasic renunciation of action is giving up of the things that you're actually responsible for. And then number 8 says, verse 8 says, Dukkamityeva yat karma karya klesha bhayat tyajet sakritva rajasam tyagam naiva tyaga phalam labhet. And next he talks about rajasic tyaga, that is relinquishment of action in the rajasic way. Dukkam ityeva yat karma, that work which you say, oh, this is miserable. This I don't like. This is painful. This is unpleasant work in any way. Kaya klesha bhayat tyajat, renouncing such action out of fear of the difficulty it brings to you. So the idea is you have something that you are to do, but you realize, oh, this is not what I wanted to do. This is not pleasant. It's unpleasant. It's going to be difficult. It's going to cause me some suffering, and I have the fear of I'm afraid of the difficulty it's going to cause me, so I'm going to give it up. I'm not going to give it up. Sakritva rajasam tyagam. Doing that is the relinquishment or the tyaga, which is rajasic. Naiva tyaga phalam labet. And one doesn't get the fruit of renunciation if one renounces in that way. So again, the tamasic relinquishment is just giving up the things that you're supposed to do, and just not doing them, giving up the actual responsibilities you have. That's tamasic. And rajasic is that you see that I'm supposed to do this. This is part of my duty, but I don't really like doing this. It's not pleasant, and it's going to cause me trouble. It may cause some physical discomfort and everything, so I'm not going to do it. That's rajasic, because the rajas, the middle quality of passion and action and reaction and great attachment and so forth, that is always seeking pleasure and running away from pain. So that's why this is rajasic tyaga. And 9, and this one is the last we'll take for today. 9, he says, Karyamityeva yat karma niyatam kriyate arjuna sangam tyaktva phalam chaiva satyaga satviko mataha. So here he says that tyaga, that relinquishment of action, is sattvic. That is the right type, the best type, the spiritual type, that which we want, which is karyam eva. This work is to be done. Bus, it's to be done, so I will do it. This is work which is I'm responsible for. This needs to be done, so I do it. Yat karma niyatam kriyate arjuna. That work which one is responsible for, again, in the sense of the old sense of nitya karma, that which is prescribed action, but in the larger sense, the more modern sense, that action which I'm actually responsible for, it's to be done, so I do it. Sangam tyaktva phalam chaiva. Having renounced attachment to the action and having renounced hankering for the fruits of action, satyaga satviko mataha. Such relinquishment of action is sattvic tyaga. So real renunciation of the real renunciation which he is defining here as tyaga. Remember at the beginning, he made a distinction between, and Arjuna made a distinction between sannyasa and tyaga, where sannyasa meant giving up the action itself, and tyaga meant giving up the desire for the fruits of all action, whatever kind of action it is. So it's that which he is praising, tyaga, the giving up of the desire for the fruits of action and attachment to the action itself. So naturally, that tyaga, that relinquishment is sattvic, is the best, is that which leads to knowledge, which leads to illumination, which is the renunciation of the attachment and the desire for the fruits of action, not the action itself, but the attachment to the action and hankering for the fruits of the action. And doing the work because it's to be done, is to be done. This is there to be done. I will do it because it's to be done. It's my responsibility. I'll take it. Again, this doesn't mean becoming a busybody and taking on all of the neighborhood responsibility for everyone because you can't sit quietly. It means that there are things that are in front of you that are there for you, things that are meant for you. And so you do them just because they're to be done. But at the same time, you do them without attachment to the action. You do it just because it's to be done, and without hankering for the fruits of the action. And so we'll stop here, and next time we will begin with verse 10, which continues the topic. And again, the topic of the three gunas will continue for some verses. So next time, again, we will start with verse 10 and continue our study of chapter 18. So again, this is the last chapter of the Gita. And as I've said many times, one never stops their study of the Gita. We can study it for a whole lifetime, and still each time we study it, we get new light from the Gita. And that's the nature of all great scripture. True scripture of any tradition is characterized by the fact that of great scripture is characterized by the fact that if you read it as a beginner, you get something from it. But you can read it for the rest of your life and you find that it keeps giving the deeper and deeper and deeper meaning. It keeps giving more and more meaning, revealing finally the highest truth. And so that's the nature of a true scripture, and that's the nature of the Gita. So we'll stop here. I'll give announcements, and then if there's any questions, I'll take those, and then the closing prayer. So for announcements, on the Thursday, we will have the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna class at 11 o'clock in the morning, as always. And Sunday, I forgot to look at what topic I gave for Sunday, so I don't remember the topic name. But if you look on our website or in your email, we sent out a flyer. It will have the topic for Sunday. But we will have the Sunday service, and then next week we'll continue with the Gita class and other classes. So Surenji, do we have any questions?
Yes, talking about asking about Nitya Karma. You say it's doing your job, which is like employment. Is considered Nitya Karma, or is it just doing japa, prayer, and meditation?
Good. So the question is about nitya karma, that is that which I talked about, in which Sri Krishna is talking about, the things that you're supposed to do every day. Does that include your job, or is it just things like japa and meditation, prayer, etc.? So no, it includes whatever. Let me back up and say that in modern context, we have to include everything that I need to do in order to be a good person. So again, in traditional times, when society was governed by the scriptures and so forth, everything was defined by the scriptures, what you were to do and how you were to do it, and what different people in different situations in life were to do. We don't have that now. And so we don't have clearly defined, well, this is your nitya karma, you belong to this class of society and this age group and so forth. So these are your varna ashrama. So this is what you're to do. That no longer is with us. And so we have to take it in an expanded sense of whatever I have to do in order to be a good person. And I don't mean good in the eyes of society, because society is the collective and it seeks its own good, which may not be your higher good. That is, society, the whole of society is not oriented towards spiritual life. And society, including your workplace and friends and so forth, and your town and state and nation, they may expect things from you that are contrary to spiritual values. So those things that you should do to be a good person, those are your nitya karma. And so that includes your work life. If you have a job, then the work at your job, to do it conscientiously and to do it to the best of your ability. Again, not as a slave of the employer or the boss, but to do it from inside, that let me try to do my best at everything I do, because that is what manifests my own inner perfection. Not because somebody else is going to criticize me, or all of that may be true, but that's not your focus. So your nitya karma means from inside, that which you should do. If one has family responsibilities for a wife or husband or children or elderly parents, then that becomes part of your nitya karma. All of those things that you need to do in order to be a good person. And that includes paying bills and so forth. You don't get praised by society for paying your electric bill, but if you don't pay it, you get bad fruits of your electricity being cut off. So, any other question? Yeah. Yes, good. Now, what is that? Yes, it should only do sattvic karma. And that is if we want to lead a spiritual life. In Sri Krishna, the greatness of Sri Krishna is, one of the many greatnesses of Sri Krishna is, and this was pointed to by Swami Vivekananda, was that he saw the proper place for everything. He saw that everybody and everyone and all the different human natures and everything has its place within the economy of the universe, that the universe depends on all of the infinite diversity we have. But accepting that, if I want to lead a spiritual life, then I try to move towards the sattvic. Now, if I'm immersed in tamas, and all of us have some tamas that we have to get over, then I can inspire rajas in order to get out of tamas. Or if on a particular day I'm feeling tamasic, then I can inspire some rajas to get out of that. But eventually, the goal is to go towards a sattva. So again, to give an example from Swamiji's life that many of you are familiar with, an older man came to Swamiji and asked him, Swamiji, what can I do to attain to perfection? And Swamiji could see that this man was lazy. He was almost inert. There's a little substance to him, not because of age, but just because he had never made anything of himself. Not in the worldly sense, but not made anything of himself inwardly. And so Swamiji said, can you steal? Can you tell a lie? And later he explained, he said that a cow doesn't steal, a wall doesn't lie, but a cow remains a cow and a wall remains a wall. Do something. It's better to do something bad than to do nothing at all. And so he later explained that what he meant was not that he was advising people to go out and steal and to lie, but that tamas often disguises itself as sattva. The person who doesn't do any harm to anybody, but who also doesn't do any good to anybody, then that's a tamasic state. A person who never does anything bad, but also never does anything at all, never does anything bad because they never do anything at all, then that's a tamasic state. So again, recognizing that, to get out of tamas, we can inspire rajas in ourselves, but only so that we can move up towards sattva. So the goal, yes, is to become sattvic, whether householder or monastic. But a householder sometimes has to exhibit rajas in order to protect themselves. They sometimes have to exhibit rajas, but if that's done from the standpoint of cultivating sattva, but exhibiting rajas in order to protect oneself, then that is good. As Sri Ramakrishna said, it's okay to hiss, just don't bite, giving the example of the cobra. That the cobra should hiss in order to scare away those that would harm it, but don't inject poison. So it's a little more complicated than just saying you should only do that which is sattvic, but that's the goal. Yes, yes. So we'll stop here and continue next time. So let me give a closing chant. Om Yam Brahma Varunendra Rudra Marutastun Vandi Divyaistavaihi Vedai Sanghapada Kramopanishadair Gayanti Yam Samagaha Dhyanavastita Tadgatena Manasa Pashyanti Yam Yogino Yasyandam Navidu Sura Suragana Devaya Tasmai Namaha. We bow to that Supreme Being, whom Brahma and other gods praise with divine hymns, whose glories the singers of the Sama hymns sing through the Vedas and Upanishads, whom the yogis see with their minds absorbed in that through meditation, and whose end and beginning neither the gods nor the asuras know. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Om Peace, peace, peace be unto us all.